So in the 1980s, there were tens of thousands of people who began to notice something strange, which is when they looked at the pages in a book, the page was shaded with a red color, but the printers insisted that they had only used black letters on white pages. So as it turns out, there was nothing about the book itself, but instead about people's brains during that time in the 80s. And it was only during that time, not before or after, that made them see red on the page. So what was it? So to understand this, we first have to step back 2,400 years when the ever observant Aristotle saw a horse stuck in a flowing river, and he watched the whole rescue operation. And when he finally looked away, it appeared that everything else, the rocks, the trees, the land, was all flowing in the opposite direction of the river. And that was the first recorded visual illusion. Now, you can easily experience the same thing, of course, if you stare at a waterfall. After keeping your eyes locked on it for a bit, look over to the rocks and trees on the side, and it looks like everything is moving upward. And this is known as the motion after effect. So why does it happen? It's because the activity of particular neurons in your brain represents downward motion, and the activity of other neurons represents upward motion, and normally these counterbalance each other. So a popular explanation for the effect is fatigue. You stare at the waterfall for a while and you exhaust these downward coding neurons temporarily, and things become unbalanced, and your brain tells you there's a net upward movement. And so this fatigue hypothesis is very appealing in its simplicity, but it turns out it's wrong, because you can try this. Stare at a downward waterfall for a while and then close your eyes really tightly, say for 3 hours. And when you open your eyes again, you'll see the rocks crawling upwards. And so this tells us it's not about a temporary energy depletion in neurons. There's something deeper going on here. And that is, the illusion comes about not because of passive fatigue, but instead because of an active recalibration that the brain is doing. So at first, the downward motion is dramatic information to your brain. As far as your brain is concerned, this is the new normal. It's a world that flows more down than up. And so what your visual system does is it carefully rebalances its expectations to mirror the world that it thinks it's in with this new normal. So when you look away from the waterfalls and toward the cliffside, the recalibrated set point becomes obvious, because now rocks and trees are all flowing upward toward the sky. And the reason your brain does this all the time is because it always wants to know the ground truth, so it can be better at detecting change. So in this case, when your visual field is filled with the sight of a waterfall, your brain tries to subtract off the downward motion. All that descending flow is not informative anymore, and so the circuitry adjusts itself to be maximally sensitive to new information. And you experience this kind of active recalibration in your brain all the time. So for example, you may know that when you get off a small boat, the land sort of seems to be rocking for a little while. It feels like you're still on the water. What you're experiencing is a negative after effect. In other words, the negative image of the water's motion, because your brain has tried to calibrate to that. And you've also noticed this sort of illusion if you are a runner. So your body is used to sending motor commands to the legs to run. And when it does that, the visual input flows past you as a result. But when you run on a treadmill at the gym, your brain doesn't get that flowing visual input. Instead, you're looking at a wall in front of you the whole time and it doesn't move. So when you step off, you experience the treadmill illusion. With each step you take towards the locker room, the scene seems to stream by you at a faster pace. It looks like you're moving forward more quickly than you really are. Because just like with Aristotle's horse or the waterfall or the post-boating wobbles, your brain is readjusting its expectations about the world. In this case, how the act of moving your legs should translate to the flow of the visual scene past your eyes. And as another example, take a look at these green horizontal and red vertical lines. So we won't have time to do this properly here, but if you were to stare at these for about 3 minutes, looking at the green and looking at the red and so on, and then what you do is you look at black and white lines, you'd perceive that the spaces between the horizontal lines look reddish and the spaces between the vertical lines looks greenish. Now, why is that? It's because when you stare at the colored figure, your brain registers that greenness has become tied to horizontal and redness to vertical. And so it adjusts to cancel out this strange correlation that's happening. And so what happens when you look back at the black and white lines again, you experience the after effect. The horizontal lines are being internally shifted towards the opposite color, red, and the vertical towards green. And by the way, this has nothing to do with fatigue, again, because in 1975, two researchers showed that if you stare at the red and green lines for 15 minutes, the after effect can last for 3.5 months. Anyway, this active recalibration of the world is why in the 1980s, people began to see text in books as appearing to have a red tint, because at that time, the population began to use computer monitors to do word processing. And unlike modern monitors, these early devices were able to display only one color. And so the text was green on a black background. And so people would stare at these horizontal green rows for hours at a time. And as a result, when they picked up a book, the horizontal text was shaded with the complementary color of red. So their brains were adjusting to a world of green horizontal lines, and their reality changed accordingly. So what this means is how much motion there is in the world, how stable the ground is, whether vision flows past us when we run, whether lines are infused with color. None of this is decided in our genetics. It's calibrated by our experience. And so the general story is that the brain takes what's expected and it makes that invisible to you. So if you look at a featureless scene that's entirely one color, let's say red, the color will quickly drain away to neutral. So you can try this yourself. You take a red ping pong ball and you cut it in half and you put these over your eyes like this. You should try this, because what you see at first is everything is red. And then pretty quickly, the color leaches away and there's no color at all. It's kind of like you're blind. And this is because your visual system has assumed that the world has become redder for some reason. And so it adapts so that you'll be sensitive to other changes. Now, here's the thing. We can talk about these kinds of illusions as adaptation, but there's another way to look at this, which is as prediction. If you subtract away the downward motion of the waterfall or the rocking of the boat, this is equivalent to predicting its continued existence. So when brain circuitry adjusts, it's making a guess about what the world is likely to be like in the next moment. It stops paying attention about news that is expected to continue. And this is because your brain doesn't want to waste energy if it doesn't have to. So the goal is to reconfigure its own circuitry to waste as little power as possible. If a pattern is coming in that's predictable, the system saves energy by structuring itself around that input so it doesn't get surprised by that. So in other words, an energy conscious brain wants to predict away everything it can to save its energy just for representing the unexpected. So with this background in hand, we can look at how we can now easily understand how drugs modify nervous systems. So consumption of a drug actually changes the number of receptors for that drug in the brain to such an extent that you can look at a brain after a person has died and determine his addictions by gauging the molecular changes. And this is why people become desensitized or tolerant to a drug. The brain comes to predict the presence of the drug, and it adapts its receptor expression so that it can maintain a stable equilibrium when it gets the next hit. So what this means is, in a physical, literal way, the brain comes to expect the drug to be there, and the biological details calibrate themselves accordingly. And because the system now is predicting a certain amount of the drug to be there, you need more to achieve the original high. And this recalibration, you can guess, is the basis of the ugly symptoms of drug withdrawal. Because the more the brain is adapted to the drug, the harder the fall when the drug is taken away. Withdrawal symptoms vary by drug, so sweating, shakes, depression, but what they all have in common is a powerful absence of something that is anticipated. And this understanding of neural predictions also gives us an understanding of heartbreak. So people that you love become a part of you, not just metaphorically, but physically. your brain absorbs people into its internal model of the world. It refashions itself around the expectation of their presence. So after the breakup with a lover, or the death of a friend, or the loss of a parent, their sudden absence represents a major departure from homeostasis. And in this way, your brain is like the negative image of everyone you've come in contact with. When they're there, your lovers, your friends, your parents, they fill in their expected shapes. But when they disappear, your brain craves for them. It's just like feeling the waves after you've stepped off the boat, or craving the drug when it's absent. In the same way, your brain calls for the people in your life to be there. So when someone moves away or rejects you or dies, your brain struggles with its thwarted expectations, and slowly, through time, it has to adjust to a world without that person. And I wrote about all these topics in my new book, Livewired, which just came out. But 24 days before it hit the shelves, my father passed away. And he was an incredible person. He was a psychiatrist. He spoke 8 languages fluently. And probably most importantly for me, he was a terrific father who never had an unkind word. And so I unexpectedly found myself experiencing this topic in the book about heartbreak. And although the death of a parent is a day for which no person can prepare, it comforted me a little bit to realize that my father was literally physically a part of my brain's circuitry. He had reached beyond his body to become embedded in the brains around him. So even though he's passed, he lives on in the heads of those who knew him and loved him. So I invite you during this time, while we're all busy with work and with chores and with the pandemic, to take a look at the people around you and really take them in, and take a moment to be astonished by the fact that your brain is constantly working behind the scenes, carving them into the beautiful topiary garden of your memories. Thank you very much.